So as soon as I see these answer choices and I notice that we have some semicolons here, right, in C, in B, I start to think, okay, well, a semicolon has a rule where in order to use one, I need to have a sentence on either side. So I'm going to read this and I'm going to think about that as I read. So let's go to the text. The Arctic Alpine Botanic Garden in Norway and the Jardim Botanico of Rio de Janeiro in Brazil are two of many botanical gardens around the world dedicated to growing diverse plant species, both native and non-native, fostering scientific research, and there's another semicolon, and educating the public about plant conservation. Now it's clear. My strategy has changed. This is not about this most common use of a semicolon. 98% of the time on the SAT and in life, the times you're going to need to think about a semicolon, it's going to be because it separates two complete sentences. Basically, it functions like a period. However, this is the other use of a semicolon. It only happens rarely, but it's very clear when it happens that they're doing it. We use it sometimes for weird lists, or I should say maybe complicated lists. Lists that have like components that aren't just like a simple word or two. So that's what's happening here. So I know I'm going to need one, mostly because I see that it's a semicolon and an and here, and so I can see the list forming. What are the components of the list? Two of the many botanicals around the world dedicated to growing diverse plant species, both native and non-native. So that's the first piece. Dedicated to growing diverse plant species. So that's one. Then it switches. Fostering scientific research. That's two. And then the final piece is and educating the public about plant conservation, right? So there's three components here. So I want to have a semicolon for sure to separate components 1 and 2 because I have a semicolon separating components 2 and 3. So let me get rid of D and A, which are semicolons. So then the question really is the both native and non-native, is this part talking about part 1 or of the list or part 2 of the list? And the species are native and non-native. So it's about that. It's not about fostering scientific research. The scientific research is not native or non-native. That just doesn't make sense. So that leaves us with B. And I will add one other thing. Why did we use a semicolon with this list in the first place, right? Why not just use a comma? Well, it all comes down to the fact that in choice B, the first item of our list, because of this extra clause, has its own comma. Both native and non-native is an extra clause that is describing the species. And maybe there would have been better ways to write this whole sentence so that it was less confusing. But what they're doing here is the first piece of the list has a comma inside of it. So then to use more commas to separate the other pieces of the list would be confusing. We'd get confused where item 1 and item 2 kind of shifted. And so people might even think that there are 4 items, right? Because there'd be 3 commas, so we'd think, oh, that's 4 different pieces of this list, and one of them would sound weird, so we'd get confused. So when we use a semicolon in a list, it's because some component of the list has a comma in it. And so we need something that's visually different to separate the items of the list so that we don't get confused what's part of like a clause and what's part of the where do the list pieces kind of chop up. So it doesn't happen often because most of the time when we write lists, they're very simple and they're just, they don't involve any commas on their own. But this is a thing that could come up. The SAT tests it from time to time, as you can see, but most of the time you can just think about a semicolon as separating 2 complete sentences. And when it does kind of fall into this weirder category, that's okay. It will be obvious because it'll be a list. And so you'll be like, oh, there's that other use. So you won't get like tricked thinking about sentence structure because you'll easily be able to shift. So you need to memorize both, but most of the time just think of a sentence, semicolon as a period, and you should be fine for semicolons.